What's this other jet doing? What's this other jet doing? Holy fuck!
Oh my God! Oh my God! Jesus fucking Christ!
Don't touch it.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh no!
Oh my God!
On September 11, 2001 in New York City, 3,000 people were killed and over 6,000 injured in an attack that brought Islamist fundamentalism to the immediate attention of the Western world. Throughout the 1990s, fundamentalists had attacked a series of locations throughout Africa and the Middle East, and in 1993, the US. Nothing, however, had prepared the West for the devastation of 2001, and the response was rapid and vicious.
Our war is against networks and groups, people who coddle them, people who try to hide them, people who fund them. This is our calling.
Invasions into Afghanistan and Iraq were fast and overwhelming. At home in the UK, fear set in, security tightened, and legislation was swiftly drafted and rolled out, with 90-day detention plans, ID cards, and heightened surveillance being pushed forward as fear drove the government to attempt to control its populace. Meanwhile, supported by a dominant right-wing press, the Muslim community was targeted and marginalised without any thought of the consequences. On July 7, 2005, the failure of the UK government's new security measures was dramatically exposed when 52 civilians were killed and over 700 injured in a series of attacks in London. The attacks exposed something further. Not only had the new measures failed to protect the UK, they had instead driven British men into radical Islam. These men did not fit the dominant government rhetoric of foreign radicals determined to spread Islamic law. They were British citizens alienated and compelled into a hatred for their home by their own government. This film asks how and why this happened, and what, if anything, can be done now.
If we can establish and spread the values of liberty, the rule of law, human rights and an open society, then that is in our national interest too. The spread of our values makes us indeed safer. Does anyone believe that Serbia or Iraq would be nations that originate conflict if they were democracies?
President Bush's war on terror was the first response to 9/11. Believing that the ends are justified by the means, armed forces stormed into Afghanistan and then Iraq. Despite the evident unpopularity and the eventual failure of these wars, Tony Blair's relationship with Bush made the UK equally central and culpable.
Internationally, they made a decision to throw in their lot, cast in their lot with the Bush administration, and that included going into Afghanistan and more recently invading Iraq. So in that sense, they've intertwined their foreign policy with what ultimately has been a failed foreign policy by the Bush administration. And because of that, in a sense, it's made us all less safe. Domestically, they brought in a raft of new legislation in an effort to curtail terrorism activities. So in that sense, it was a bit of a very much a legalistic approach to terrorism.
This response, based on extensive new laws, allowed human rights to be swept away with the constant justification of national security. One of the most frightening new laws, allowing extended detention without charge, was introduced. Gradually, these laws became more insidious, aiming at indirect terrorism, attacking more and more rights of free speech and privacy.
There was a series of rushed legislation starting in 2001, where the principal focus of that legislation was to deal with problems with relating to detaining individuals who were a threat or perceived to be a threat, and they enacted laws which allowed detention without trial. An accompanying set of provisions recently enacted are concerned with activities which may be considered to be quite a long way divorced from terrorism but may give rise to or support it. So there are various new speech offences, for instance, directly or indirectly encouraging terrorism. And there are new offences related to engaging in activity for the preparation of an act of terrorism, which could be quite a long way away. And finally, there is a range of different provisions, I suppose, or measures, not always in Acts of Parliament, about the collection of information, the retention of information, and the sharing of information about individuals generally, or persons who may have become subject to suspicion.
The desire to prevent further attacks led the government to keep a constant, fearful eye on the entire British population. Biometrics then became fashionable, particularly in the form of national identity cards, a scheme that was immediately unpopular, and many activist groups were formed to question its use and validity.
Well, the government's pushed forward this legislation, pushed it onto the statute books by claiming it was going to tackle terrorism. But in fact, when you look at the people who should know, senior members of the security services, even the former Home Secretary Charles Clarke, who said the day after the 7/7 London bombings, he said, "I don't believe that ID cards would stop this or any terrorist atrocity." ID cards won't stop a terrorist. If you look at the case of the 7/7 bombings, were we under the sort of ID card regime that is proposed, all of the bombers would have had valid official UK ID cards. So it really doesn't stand up. It's not going to stop terrorists committing atrocities. So from making this very, very strong claim that we had to have ID cards because it was an essential tool against terrorism, I think is a huge gap between the perception of what they tried to sell it on and what actually this thing could even do.
The government's disregard for the unease felt by the population about ID cards was highlighted in October 2008 when Jackie Smith unveiled the first leg of the scheme, targeting foreign nationals.
We all need to be able to prove who we are quickly, easily and securely when travelling, when opening a bank account, when applying for a new job. We also want to be sure that others are who they say they are, to protect ourselves and our families against ID fraud and to help protect our community against crime, illegal immigration and terrorism.
Fears of a Big Brother state continue to grow, with race relations now at its core.
I'm really worried about identity cards in terms of race relations. By starting implementation with foreign nationals, the government's adopting a divide and rule strategy, hoping to soften us up by starting with the foreign nationals first. But who is going to be asked to produce the identity card? It's going to be people who look like me, not people who look like the Home Secretary.
The fear that the UK was becoming a Big Brother state was balanced by the equal fear that the government could not protect personal data. As the government began to make identity protection the focal point of their ID card campaign, a series of crises involving lost personal details further heightened the fear felt by the public that the government could not be trusted to guard them.
I saw this on the news today, that's Jackie Smith unveiling the identity card. Next item on the news, they've lost the details of 10,000 teachers. Yeah. And at first I actually thought there might have been a point to the identity card, but it became rapidly apparent to me that it's just beyond the competence of this government. I mean, no matter how much the theory are going to be, they will just mess it up.
The issue with ID cards isn't necessarily the fact that everyone is carrying an ID card, it's the safety of the data behind the card. Is it going to be safe? Is it going to be secure? And all the evidence points to the fact that this government is not able to keep our personal data safe, that it has.
If passports can be forged, if credit cards can be forged, ultimately these ID cards will be forged. And so those who are interested in carrying out crime or identity theft, they're going to find a way around these ID cards. It's like sort of water flowing against an obstacle. It will find its way around eventually.
The government's response was not entirely based on new forms of surveillance, but also emphasised the usefulness of more established forms. The UK has been blanketed with CCTV cameras for 2 decades, and it is now estimated that Britain has 1 camera for every 10 people. In the wake of the 2001 and 2005 bombings, both the government and the media seemed keen to promote CCTV as a preventative measure.
By the time that the 2001 bombings or the 2005 bombings occurred, Britain already had a massive surveillance CCTV network. If anything, what the London bombing shows is the powerlessness of CCTV to prevent a major attack on a city.
In reality, over 95% of the footage that's gathered by CCTV is either utterly useless or inadmissible in court.
CCTV footage is very difficult to deal with. Often the cameras are not pointing in the right way, the images are blurred.
If someone is willing to die for the cause, they don't care if their image is captured. In fact, they might prefer that their image be captured because it can be used in propaganda material. It also creates maybe a wider sense of fear in the wider population. So in that sense, it's not useful at all because in a sense it's a reactive technology. It captures the image after the crime has occurred, not before.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the end of our film. However, something very much like this could happen at any moment. We just thought we ought to prepare you and more or less put you in the mood. Thank you. And now back to our story.
The media was complicit in creating a public perception of the government's effectiveness at tackling the threat of terrorism. The press fostered the climate of fear that 9/11 and 7/7 had sparked. Routine denunciation of Muslims in the right-wing press and spotlights on radical Islamists like Abu Hamza al-Masri heightened the perceived threat of attack which never came, supporting the government's claims of successful policy. In particular, CCTV footage and other forms of surveillance became a constant presence in the media, hailed as a successful and important part of preventing further attacks.
I think the media, in a sense, plays into the government's hand by emphasizing the role of surveillance often in terms of solving crimes and things like that, and overplaying, because if you think about it, when a crime happens, when anti-terrorism happens, the media latch on to those images from the CCTV cameras. And, they grab those images. It makes for a dramatic picture on the front of the Sun, showing the last moments of the terrorist. So there is this sense that's given out to the public that this is an effective tool because, look, they can see for themselves. They can see the images. They can see the footage on the 10 o'clock news. So the media does play into creating this notion in some quarters that this technology is really effective and useful.
It seems like it's inevitable that if you're caught on camera, you will be caught and then prosecuted and maybe successfully punished. And this is the problem. We see a very, very selected highlights on television that make us think that this is a magic technology that will solve the problem of crime. It doesn't.
I think if you public opinion polls, many Britons are actually in favour of the technology because the perception is, I've got nothing, I haven't done anything wrong, I've got nothing to worry about.
The media's promotion of mass surveillance tools as an effective measure against terrorism keeps public opinion high, particularly amongst the right wing. But more than promoting an artificially rosy picture of surveillance, the media omits important facts about its use. Not all citizens will encounter surveillance equally. It is those perceived to be the most threatening who will be targeted. In a climate of fear centred on Islamic radicalisation, Muslim communities and individuals bore the brunt of surveillance operations, often just for being Muslim. The net was cast too wide, and as a result spread mistrust and alienation through the targeted communities.
One of the problems I have is that some groups disproportionately experience surveillance. And I'm talking specifically about often marginalized communities. In the case of the war on terror, Muslim communities, they experience surveillance not only in the form of the sort of dispassionate camera on a pole, but also government agencies recruiting informers and either recruiting from within their communities or sending people in their communities to spy directly in the mosques, schools, places like that. And it's those communities, ironically, are the ones that really you need to reach out and bring on side.
I think the difficulty is that on the one hand, one has a human rights objection to measures which apply to everybody, right? CCTV or whatever. We say, well, everybody couldn't possibly be a subject of suspicion. The response to that sometimes officially is to say, okay, well, we'll narrow it down a bit and we'll identify those general sections of the population who are more likely than everybody to be involved in unlawful activity. And of course, that's where the misstep comes, because it's not narrow enough, it's not particular enough.
Where you know that a particular person or a particular group of people are actively planning a campaign of violence or bombing, where you have the intelligence from other members of the community that that group is going to undertake that, then targeting those people is an efficient, rational resource for the security services, because it is based on accurate, timely, useful knowledge, and that comes from a trustful society, a society where people are prepared to give information to the police. Generating intelligence just from surveillance, from mass surveillance, is one costly, it's unreliable, and it's very difficult. What it leads to is the blanket suspicion falling on all members of a community, so that all members of a particular, an Asian community, for instance, are stopped and searched on the street. Not those that are most likely to be a particular target, which you know because you have good intelligence. Just anyone who fits the stereotypical image. And that is poor policing. It's policing almost that has failed. It's failed because it's just treating everybody as a potential suspect. And the damage that that does is it makes those people who would normally be supportive and law-abiding of the police to come increasingly into hostile and conflictual contact with police, to feel that they are themselves being treated as a suspect when they're not, to feel that they are being undermined and undervalued as a member of a society. It fuels the radicals' demands, and that is what we need to make sure doesn't happen.
And the thing to remember with surveillance, it creates distance. Surveillance creates social distance. And this gives a strong message to society about what the government or the watching body or whatever feels about society. It feels it has to monitor and control at a distance. It feels that it not really interested in community, in trust. So if you start basing the provision of government on this kind of distantiated measurement and monitoring of people, you're starting to commit really slow social suicide, because you're undermining trust, undermining community relations by giving a message that, well, you know, I want to know what you're doing, therefore I'm going to watch you all the time. It's not a very comforting or pleasant experience, and brings forward all kinds of anxieties on the part of people.
After the bombings of 2005, the perpetrators' martyrdom videos were released. They showed British men explaining their reasons for committing such atrocities. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were their primary motivation.
Your democratically elected governments continuously perpetuate atrocities against my people all over the world, and your support of them makes you directly responsible.
The government's policy had failed to protect Britain. Instead, they had driven moderate Muslims into violent radicalisation. What the government termed the battle for winning hearts and minds had been lost. The British government continues to deny the failure of its policy and has refused to conduct an inquiry into what caused these men to murder 52 fellow citizens. Instead, they maintain the rhetoric that Islam could not be reasoned with. Their refusal to engage with the legitimate fears of Muslim communities further heightens their alienation.
The government was being warned prior to 7/7, being warned by its own intelligence services that young British people, British Muslims, were being increasingly feeling alienated over British foreign policy, over the invasion of Iraq. The government did nothing about this, and then after 7/7, it denied it. There's a real risk of alienating people that you actually need to have on side. Because the problem is, I mean, you've got a sort of a small, hardcore group of extremists who, in a sense, you really can't reason with and negotiate with because they've already been radicalized. The group that you need to reach out to are sort of almost free floaters who aren't necessarily hostile to the British government, the British state, the British people, but have the potential of being alienated and thereby recruited by the people that you really need to be concerned about. So whenever you bring in repressive measures, stop and search, or when you tie yourself to an unpopular foreign policy coming out of Washington, D.C., you simply aren't thinking long-term, and you aren't thinking about this issue of what so-called winning hearts and minds, and that, I think, ultimately has been a major failure of the British government.
The way you prevent crime and the way you get intelligence is when you have a community that is willing to give information to the police and the security services when they feel that they are on the same side. If you have a surveillance system that alienates members of a particular community to make them feel that the state is against them, that the state is targeting them as terrorists even when they are not, this is more likely to turn such people to be sympathetic, at least, to the position of those who are prepared to take extremist actions. And we have to understand that good societies are not societies that rely on security through technology, but a good society is one that relies on security through human cooperation and human interaction.
The government's response to the threat of terrorist attacks since 2001 has failed. Ill-thought-out laws were swiftly rushed through, wars were started, spreading death and destruction that was broadcast around the world, and a discourse of cultural collision and good versus evil prevailed, a discourse that demonised those communities whose hearts it was most critical to win. Measures that attempted to monitor and control the public served only to isolate them further. While experts both within and outside the government continue to vocally question the effectiveness of the Labour government's response, they have refused to change direction. The failure of the government's flawed approach to Islamist terrorism was viscerally highlighted in July 2005, but neither this atrocity nor the clear exposition of motives given by the perpetrators themselves could change the trend of the government's response. In October 2008, the first ID cards were rolled out to non-EU nationals to widespread objection. Outreach programmes remain small, underfunded and underpromoted, and volunteers are often viewed as spies by our now deeply suspicious Muslim community. The profoundly misguided policies of the Labour government have angered and alienated all but the far right and caused immeasurable damage to race relations in Britain. With so much damage caused, one must now question how far it is possible to repair it, and how much the government is even willing to try.
If, God forbid, any terrorist act happens in this country, believe you me, people are not going to be asking whether this legislation is too draconian, whether it's too great an incursion into people's civil liberties. No one's going to be saying that to me. They're going to be saying, are you sure it was tough enough?